All right, let's dive into one of the most important and honestly, one of the most misunderstood periods in all of American history, Reconstruction. It was this incredible time of promise, of radical, revolutionary change, but it was a promise that was ultimately and tragically abandoned.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1865. The Civil War is finally over, the guns have gone quiet. But the entire nation is facing this absolutely massive question, one that's going to define its future. For 4 million African Americans, freedom isn't just a dream anymore. But what does that freedom actually look like? What rights, what opportunities, what kind of future is waiting for them? This was the question at the very heart of Reconstruction.
And you know, no one really understood the gravity of this moment better than Frederick Douglass. He knew that ending slavery wasn't the finish line, not even close. It was the starting gun. The really hard work, the work of building a nation of true equals, well, that was all just getting started.
So, how did the nation even begin to answer this huge question? Well, the first few steps were shaky, they were controversial, and they immediately showed this deep, fundamental conflict over what America was really going to become. The first big move was the 13th Amendment. On paper, this was huge. It constitutionally wiped out the institution of slavery. But here's the thing you gotta notice. Look at what it doesn't say. It says nothing about citizenship, nothing about voting, nothing about owning property, nothing about equality under the law. So yeah, it answered one massive question, but it left a dozen others just hanging in the air. And this created a huge power vacuum, with two completely different visions for the country's future. On one side, you had President Andrew Johnson. He just wanted to get the South back into the Union fast, which meant going really easy on the ex-Confederates, and basically letting the Southern states figure out what rights freed people should have. But on the other side, a growing group in Congress had a much more radical idea: use the full power of the federal government to totally remake the South and guarantee black citizenship and the right to vote. This wasn't just some policy disagreement, it was a battle for the soul of America.
And you can see the results of Johnson's hands-off approach almost instantly. Southern states felt totally empowered, so they passed what became known as the Black Codes. These laws were designed from the ground up to control the lives and labor of newly freed people, creating a system that was, as one person put it, basically slavery by another name. And this horrified people in the North.
Yeah, those Black Codes, they were a massive wake-up call. Congress basically decided Johnson's plan was a disaster and took control of Reconstruction themselves. And what came next was a truly radical, totally unprecedented experiment, a federal effort to build a genuine, multiracial democracy right out of the ashes of a slave society.
So the bedrock of this whole new plan? It was a trio of constitutional amendments. We already talked about the 13th. The 14th Amendment was a total game changer. It established that if you're born here, you're a citizen, and it guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. Then came the 15th Amendment, which said you couldn't deny someone the right to vote based on their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Put together, these three were nothing short of a constitutional revolution.
But look, Congress knew that just writing this stuff down wasn't going to be enough. To give these amendments some real teeth, they passed the Military Reconstruction Act. This was the enforcement. It literally divided the South into military districts and used the U.S. Army to register voters, protect them at the polls, and make sure the new state governments were actually following the rules. This was federal power on a scale nobody had ever seen before.
And the result? It was immediate and just astounding. 700,000. That's how many black men were registered to vote across the South. It was a seismic shift in political power, and it led to hundreds of black officials being elected to local, state, and even federal office for the very first time.
But we've got to be real here. This new power, it had its limits. The gains were absolutely revolutionary, but they were also fragile and fiercely fought over. Black political power never really reached its full potential. White Republicans were still usually in the top jobs, and just trying to exercise your power was incredibly dangerous. I mean, just ask the family of Mississippi Senator Charles Caldwell, who was assassinated in the street for his political work.
And that brings us to the next, and frankly, brutal part of this story. All the progress that was made during radical Reconstruction, it didn't go unanswered. A violent, organized, and deeply determined backlash rose up with one single goal: destroy this experiment in democracy and restore white supremacy. You see, there was this really interesting psychological shift happening. Under slavery, a lot of white Southerners had this sort of paternalistic, condescending view of black people. But once emancipation happened and black men started voting and holding office, that condescension turned into a deep, profound fear. Black success was suddenly seen as a direct threat, and that fueled a much more violent and hateful kind of racism.
And the group that really embodied this backlash? The Ku Klux Klan. I mean, look at this. You don't have to read between the lines at all. This was a question asked of every potential member, and it lays their goal completely bare. This wasn't about economics or states' rights. It was about one thing: ensuring a white man's government, using terror to get it. And you gotta understand, the Klan's violence wasn't just random chaos. No, it was strategic. This data from Mississippi shows exactly what they were targeting: the very symbols of black progress. They burned down schools because education was a ticket to empowerment. They murdered teachers and political leaders because those were the people building a new future. The whole point was to terrorize the black community right back into submission.
Now, for a little while, it looked like the federal government was going to win this fight. Under President Ulysses S. Grant, Congress passed the Force Acts, which basically gave him the authority to use the military to go after the Klan. And for a time, it actually worked. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested, and the organization was pretty much crushed. But the national will to keep up that fight, it was already starting to fade.
And that brings us to the final and really tragic chapter here. The radical experiment of Reconstruction didn't end because it failed. It ended because the rest of the country, especially the North, just gave up on it.
So, why? Why did they give up? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was kind of like a perfect storm. A huge part of it was just exhaustion. President Grant himself said the public was tired out by the constant problems and violence in the South. Then, a massive economic depression hit in 1873, and suddenly everyone was way more worried about their own finances. Add to that the Amnesty Act, which gave voting rights back to former Confederates, and you just have a nation that's losing its resolve.
And then, the final nails in the coffin, they came fast. In 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau, this key agency helping former slaves, was just allowed to collapse. In 1875, one last Civil Rights Act was passed, but it had no real power. And then came the big one, 1877. As part of a backroom deal to settle a disputed presidential election, the federal troops were pulled out of the South for good. Reconstruction was officially over.
The end of Reconstruction ushered in the whole era of Jim Crow segregation, and it would be almost 100 years before the federal government would even try to protect the civil rights of African Americans again. So it leaves us with this big, lingering question. The era itself ended in 1877, sure, but the fundamental debates it brought up about who gets to be a citizen, what equality really means, and what the government's role is in protecting our rights, those questions never went away. In so many ways, we are all still living with the legacy of that abandoned promise today.